Good evening, I'm Adrienne Arsenault. Tonight, Michael Kovrig has been held by China for a year and a half. Now, for the first time, his family speaks out.
And he is in a fight for his life.
An exclusive interview with Kovrig's wife, her message for China.
You are holding an innocent man.
The family's private fight to secure his release.
It's time for us to take action. Words are no longer enough.
How do you think the Canadian government's handled this?
And why she thinks Ottawa could do so much more.
I'm Andrew Chang. Also tonight, a startling surge in COVID cases.
I think it's time to ring the alarm bells.
In the U.S. and around the world, how politics is driving infections. Another deadly encounter with police.
This system is not meant to be there for us.
Calls for the officer who shot a man inside an apartment to be fired.
A show of solidarity for NASCAR's only black driver, the apparent target of a racist attack.
I wanted to show whoever it was that you're not going to take away my smile.
This is The National. For 560 days now, a year and a half, two Canadians known as the two Michaels have been imprisoned in China.
Their stories are twisted up in international politics, seemingly tied to the fate of a Huawei executive, and today the subject of new sparring between Canada and China. Their loved ones have been on the sidelines until now.
In a broadcast exclusive interview tonight, Michael Kovrig's wife is speaking out about what he's enduring and what she says the Canadian government could do to help him. For Kovrig's family, this is a delicate balance. The risk of talking publicly, angering China by pushing for his release, and the risk of not talking. But as Veena Najibullah told me, it's time.
We have to do something now. That words are no longer enough. We have to take action.
More than a year of waiting, watching, silently working away, Veena Najibullah wants more done to free her husband, Michael Kovrig.
How's Michael managing?
Basically, he has been confined to a single cell for this entire time. He has not gone outside. He has not seen a tree or had fresh air to breathe for 560 days. In one of his letters, he says that it really weighs on the soul when you can't see more than 10 feet in any direction.
Kovrig and another Canadian, Michael Spavor, have been held by Chinese authorities since 2018. Though the charges of spying were only laid last Friday.
These accusations are groundless. They're baseless. Their detention was arbitrary since day one. There is no doubt why this happened.
Did you immediately think, aha, this is retaliation for Meng Wanzhou?
Yes, I mean, having lived in China, having studied China, having studied international affairs and being in the world that I'm in of politics and diplomacy, it wasn't hard to put two and two together.
It was just days after Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou was arrested in Vancouver on a U.S. extradition warrant that Kovrig and Spavor were picked up in China. Canada says the detention of the two men is politically motivated, but that its hands are tied on the Meng case.
If Canada maintains that the judicial process is independent, it can't intervene politically. What's Canada's move here?
Since the beginning, this has been positioned, the extradition has been positioned as a judicial matter, is before the courts. So to make sense of all of that, I asked a lawyer here in Toronto, a lawyer of national reputation, Brian Greenspan and his team, and they unequivocally say that extradition is not a criminal proceeding. There is no deference to the courts. There is no, if you step in as a minister of justice, that is somehow a violation of the rule of law.
And what does the Canadian government say to you when you bring this up?
Now we have introduced all of this, submitted this to the government, to the Minister of Justice. Minister Lametti has seen the legal opinion, has received letters explaining that legal opinion and asking for action. There has been no reply.
No reply, but a response today from the Prime Minister to a question about that legal opinion. As David Cochrane tells us, Justin Trudeau maintains there will be no political interference.
It has been obvious from the beginning that this was a political decision made by the Chinese government, and we deplore it. And
the Prime Minister wouldn't go as far as calling the two Michaels hostages, but he made it clear the Chinese government is detaining them to try to secure the release of Meng Wanzhou.
They made those links from the very beginning and continue to put political pressure on Canada through that detention, which is something that not just we deplore, but countries around the world are speaking up to deplore.
It's clear how Canada sees things, equally clear China sees things differently. A Chinese spokesperson called the Prime Minister's comments linking the detentions to Meng Wanzhou irresponsible, while at the same time urging Canada to release the Huawei executive immediately.
No, we're not considering that.
Trudeau rejected that idea and the idea of trying to swap Meng for the Michaels, insisting politics will play no role in Meng's case.
We are proceeding in a way that defends and upholds the independence of our judicial system, and we will not interfere politically.
But Canada continues to take steps diplomatically, reaching out to allies like the United States, where Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called the charges against the Michaels politically motivated and completely groundless, called for their immediate release, and condemned the use of these unjustified detentions to coerce Canada. Other allies like the G7 and the European Union have also stepped up to condemn China, but they've all failed to persuade China. The Michaels remain in detention. It's now 560 days and counting. David Cochran, CBC News, Ottawa.
And we're going to continue this conversation in about 15 minutes with much more of my interview with Veena Najibullah.
All right, sounds good. Turning now to Canada's battle against COVID-19. 104 days in, clear progress in containing the virus. For 2 straight weeks, fewer than 500 daily cases, just 300 today. And there are more people getting better than getting sick. In Ontario, 214 recoveries and 161 cases. And in Quebec, 184 recoveries and just 69 new cases. And for the first time since mid-March, Quebec reported no deaths from the virus. Even so, there are still serious concerns across the country about the pace of reopening, including in Edmonton, where several restaurants have re-closed. Rafi Boudjikanian tells us why.
There's a lot more of this going on at Northern Chicken right now, but that doesn't mean you can grab a bite inside.
Yeah, we kept going through takeout the entire time. We did really good on takeout.
Limiting to that and delivery since the pandemic hit, dining in too much of a risk. But many in Alberta took a different approach and began reopening in mid-May. Now, at least 5 restaurants and pubs in Edmonton are closed again because of staff or customers who've been sick.
Even though that close contact, we were not in front of them, we still served them food. We washed the dishes that they ate from.
Despite precautions, Samuel Lee got bad news last week. He shut down this bar for a couple of days after a customer told him they tested positive. Now he's waiting for test results from his staff.
The biggest thing is having everyone's attitude change about the coronavirus.
Testing is widely available in Alberta, and health experts say this latest scare shows it's time to start targeting workplaces, starting with those dealing with the public.
It's also very important that maybe we should be looking at testing people more frequently, not just asking them to consider being tested, but actually going ahead to suggest testing in those groups.
As for whether the province opened too early, Saxinger says it's too soon to say.
I think we're going to be getting a sense right now on whether or not people became overconfident, or whether we're just picking up some dregs and pieces of leftover epidemic.
Meanwhile, some Albertans think reopening restaurants so soon might not have been prudent, and say takeout is the way to go for now. Rafi Boudjikanian, CBC News, Edmonton.
There is some good news for Torontonians desperate for a haircut as the city joins most of the rest of Ontario entering stage 2 of reopening. So barbers and hairdressers, restaurant patios, public pools and shopping malls can all reopen in Toronto and Peel region on Wednesday. Only Windsor-Essex remains in Ontario's stage 1 because of an outbreak among migrant farm workers. Today, the Premier had a blunt message about that.
I'm going to just tell it the way it is. Farmers just aren't cooperating. They aren't sending out the people to get tested. We got to bang our heads off the wall and figure out why. It's just not fair.
Ford hinted at stronger action if worker testing doesn't improve. Since Friday, Windsor-Essex has seen 66 new COVID-19 cases, 52 of them in the agriculture sector. 3 migrant workers have now died in Ontario since the pandemic began. And Mounties have fined several American tourists for violating public health orders by visiting Banff National Park over the past week. The Canada-U.S. border is still officially closed to non-essential travel until at least July 21st, and that includes parks and tourist sites. Now, the U.S. is seeing a dramatic jump in cases, especially in the south and west. As Steve D'Souza shows us, that's causing some new worries as more communities reopen.
For the first time in weeks, people in Washington, D.C. will be able to eat indoors. The second phase of reopening began today, with nail salons and gyms also back in business.
I kind of trust that they're making the right decision and the numbers seem to be doing okay.
New York and Washington are among the last to reopen as their numbers trend down. But across the south and western parts of the country, a sharp rise in coronavirus cases. In Texas, 11 consecutive days of record-high hospitalizations. In California, more than a third of current cases came in the last 2 weeks. Experts say it's a sign that some states rush to reopen.
I think it's time to ring the alarm bells. If history plays out the way it has so far, without those states closing down and really pulling back on opportunities for the virus to transmit, it's going to keep getting very bad.
At a weekend rally, the president blamed high testing rates for the rise in cases.
So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please.
Asked if the president really told officials to slow down testing to improve the numbers.
It was a comment that he made in jest. It's a comment that he made in passing.
Trump, however, didn't offer the same explanation.
Did you ask to slow it down?
If it did slow down, frankly, I think we're way ahead of ourselves, if you want to know the truth.
But in Florida, the Republican governor says testing doesn't explain the surge.
Even with testing increasing or being flat, the number of people testing positive is accelerating faster than that.
With simple mitigation measures like wearing a mask now politicized, some experts worry about what will happen in the fall.
My fear is that we're going to have uncontrolled epidemics that explode and overwhelm health systems.
The White House says it's stocking up for a second wave, but experts worry the first wave is far from over. Stephen D'Souza, CBC News, New York.
And indeed, globally, the pandemic does seem to be accelerating, with more than 9 million confirmed infections now being reported worldwide. Yesterday saw the biggest jump in cases in a single day. Outside of the United States, Brazil, Russia, and India round out the hardest hit countries. Yesterday, Brazil saw a record 54,000 new infections, passing the million case mark. India, meanwhile, saw more than 15,000 new cases. That was a daily record. But as Chris Brown shows us, that hasn't stopped authorities from reopening.
Fires burn continuously at Delhi's largest crematorium, trying to keep up with the dead from coronavirus.
My father is gone. They have taken it from me.
Anguished businessman Tarun Bhushan told our producer the capital's hospital system is being crushed. Doctors kept telling him his father was doing fine, but really, he says, no one was caring for him.
He's okay, you please wait, as the days will pass, he will become okay, but yesterday he was gone. The total infrastructure is failed, our government is failed, everything is failed.
Health authorities say Delhi may soon need 150,000 hospital beds to cope. Right now, it only has 9,000.
It seems that almost every day we reach a new and grim record.
Today, the World Health Organization said a surge in infections in places such as India and Brazil is deeply worrying, as is the politicization of the virus. In Brazil, 50,000 are dead, and yet the government of President Jair Bolsonaro continues to resist measures to slow the virus's spread. Russia is rehearsing for a huge military parade in Moscow, even as cases outside the capital are on the rise. And in India, after a difficult lockdown was lifted, infections have soared. While 14,000 official deaths is still a fairly low number, the reality in rural India may be far worse, says this Canadian epidemiologist who studies mortality rates in India.
Because they occur in the rural areas at home, they don't have medical attention, so you simply don't have a death certificate or a certification. People just cremate in the fields or bury in the fields of the village.
Indian authorities insist not all parts of the vast nation are in such bad shape, but in the capital it's desperate enough to start repurposing old train carriages as hospital wards. Chris Brown, CBC News, Vancouver.
Well, here in Canada, the family of an Ontario man killed by Peel Regional Police during a wellness check this weekend are now calling for a public inquiry. They also want the officer fired. Dave Seglins has more on the latest deadly incident to raise questions about using armed police to respond to mental health crises.
Another death, another protest. This one for Ijaz Chowdhury, a 62-year-old father of 4 who on the weekend was in crisis.
My uncle was a harmless man. He had no power to hurt anyone.
Chowdhury's family says on Saturday they called a non-emergency number hoping for help.
You're in a mental health crisis, and you're faced by people with guns, people with body armor, people with authority over you.
The Peel Regional Police today offered condolences and asked for patience during the investigation.
We demand a public inquiry into what took place, and we also demand that the officer involved in shooting our uncle is removed immediately from Peel Police.
All of this amidst a global debate over how police use their weapons, how they use force, not just on crime suspects, but also on people suffering mental health crisis.
In the last month, several other people have died after interactions with police responding to emergency calls.
We have to question the logic of having heavily armed agents of the state conducting so-called wellness checks.
This researcher says mental health workers and not armed police officers should be responding to many crisis calls.
Over the past 2 decades, studies have shown that about 70% of the people in this country who are killed by police officers have either mental health issues and or substance abuse issues. 70% of the persons killed by police.
No justice, no peace!
He says as protests mount over police use of deadly force, he's optimistic that governments are realizing there may be better ways to respond. Dave Seglin, CBC News, Mississauga.
Next week in Saskatchewan, a Canadian first. A new law will come into force letting police tell someone if their intimate partner has a history of abuse. But as Bonnie Allen explains, today a curveball. The RCMP says it won't take part.
It's taken a year of negotiations to get police ready to implement Clare's Law in Saskatchewan. Starting Monday, women at risk would be able to ask for sensitive information about a partner's violent past, or police could volunteer it. But now the RCMP, which serves most of rural Saskatchewan, is refusing to do so.
I'm extremely disappointed to hear that the RCMP will not be participating.
Joanne Duzel represents all the women's shelters in Saskatchewan. She says under Clare's Law, RCMP in rural or remote communities could warn women who enter a relationship with a serial offender.
And now the RCMP are not in a position to warn them. That is definitely problematic.
Saskatchewan RCMP issued a lengthy statement assuring that domestic violence is not a private affair, but it must consider how best it can support Clare's Law objectives within its obligations under the Federal Privacy Act.
We were caught off guard that they went ahead with this a week ago and said, no, we're not participating.
Saskatchewan's Justice Minister sent a letter to Ottawa expressing disappointment and frustration.
I wish they would have raised it a year ago when we started to engage with the RCMP.
This researcher says privacy concerns are often stumbling blocks to helping victims.
And getting different bits of agencies to share information with one another.
It is only a person at risk of harm from an individual who would ever have any access to sensitive information. So I really don't understand this decision by the RCMP.
It's not clear what the privacy issue is or how it could be resolved. But what is clear is that this won't just affect Saskatchewan. Several other provinces the RCMP serves are also poised to roll out Clare's Law. Bonnie Allen, CBC News, Regina.
Okay, you're going to want to stick around for Adrian's broadcast exclusive interview right after this.
For the first time, Michael Kovrig's wife takes us inside the family's fight for his freedom.
We made a decision that it's time for us to speak.
Up next, Michael's story.
He is one of the strongest, most determined people I've ever met.
A glimpse inside his brutal Chinese detention from their one phone call.
Probably the most sort of meaningful and impactful 16 minutes and 42 seconds of my life.
And his emotional letters from the other side of the world.
Let me share the love I have for you, and we'll get through this together. Love, Michael.
We're back in 2. Michael Kovrig was on leave as a diplomat and working full-time with the International Crisis Group on de-escalating global conflicts when in December of 2018 he was detained in China on suspicion of endangering national security. Businessman Michael Spavor was also detained, same accusation. The two Michaels had met in China, but they weren't friends. They were, though, about to be inextricably linked to each other and to Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, arrested by Canadian authorities just days earlier on a request from the United States. The men held in retaliation for her detention. That was and still is the presumption of many. It's happened before.
We have continued to express our disappointment with the Chinese decision, with the Chinese detention of these two Canadians. We will continue to advocate for their release, for their return to Canada.
Calls for their release have come from around the globe, but one person fighting perhaps harder than anyone in the world for their freedom has stayed out of the headlines. She is Veena Najibullah, Kovrig's wife. They separated before he was detained, but she is, as she says, his person. She's also a geopolitical expert with nearly 2 decades worth of experience with the UN and civil society groups. She's been banging down the doors of power for every one of the last 560 days. And while the men have now been charged, she's not finished fighting. She is, though, finished with being silent. We met today to talk about saving Michael, saving both Michaels. So, Veena, I know the pandemic is the least of your concerns, but we can't ignore it, so I'm sorry we have to be this far apart.
It's okay, I understand.
Appreciate
Better be safe.
You've been quiet for the entire time of his detention. Why did you decide to talk now? What have you been weighing?
As Michael's family, we have spent the last 560 days working closely with the government, with all stakeholders, and focusing on private diplomacy, on behind-the-scenes efforts to secure Michael's freedom. And after 560 days of patiently waiting and hoping, and a ton of moments of, okay, maybe something will happen, maybe something has happened, we made a decision that it's time for us to speak.
Have you been worried, though, that speaking would either affect him or maybe affect your relationship with the government?
Absolutely. Since day one, our main concern has been do no harm. Make sure Michael's safety and well-being is number one in our minds. And do whatever we can to bring him home. I mean, and we've been trusting the government. We've been working very closely with the government. And that is one of the reasons why until now we have remained quiet and giving that every chance we could.
So China says they were spying. Is it at all possible it's true?
No. I mean...
How do you know?
Because these accusations are groundless. They're baseless. Their detention was arbitrary since day one. That is what our government and that's what many other governments around the world have clearly stated. There is no doubt why this happened. Even Chinese officials in various elaborate ways have made it clear that there is a link between what took place on December 1, 2018 with the arrest of Meng Wanzhou and the subsequent detention of the two Michaels.
So you used the word arbitrary.
Yes.
China's heard that word. China said last night, a Chinese official, that there's no such thing as arbitrary detention in China.
They have been making that point all along, that this is following their own process. They have an independent judiciary and so forth. The facts remain. And like I said, there have been a number of occasions where that has been made clear to Canadians, that Canada needs to untie the knot. Canada needs to solve this problem, and the other elements will go back to the way they were.
Can you tell me about Michael?
Sure. Well, I've known Michael for almost 20 years. We met in grad school. We studied together. He and I have been married for many, many years. He's my best friend. He's my family. So I'm not objective, but I would say that he's a great man. He wants to make the world a better place. And that's why, unfortunately, he is in this situation. That's why he was in China.
And he proposed to you at the UN.
That's right. Yes. It was a UN proposal, Canadian UN proposal. At the time, he was with the Canadian mission to the United Nations. He was working there. I mean, we're still legally married, but we're separated. And regardless of our romantic status, he is a very important person in my life. He's my family. And I have been doing everything I can for the last 560 days to secure his freedom.
And to him, who are you?
I am his person, like he's my person. We have each other's back, and he is in a fight for his life. And I am in his corner, just like everybody else in his family. When we were both at the United Nations, and I spent a lot of time in war zones because of my work, he would always say, no matter where you are, if something bad happens, I will be there and I'll get you out. I have your back.
And so, for Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, she's put everything else in her life on hold. These just a sample of the meticulous notes and diaries she's kept of meetings in Washington and Ottawa, endless phone calls and to-do lists for securing their freedom, and the worries about how they are, especially her Michael. How's Michael managing?
Well, it's hard for us to know. The last consular visit was on January 14th. Basically, he has been confined to a single cell for this entire time. He has not gone outside. He has not seen a tree or had fresh air to breathe for 560 days. He says that it really weighs on the soul when you can't see more than 10 feet in any direction. He has not been able to see more than 10 feet in any direction. His life, as he calls it, is very monastic, very sparse. For the first 6 months, he was in solitary confinement, which means completely isolated, interrogated for many, many hours. Since then, the situation has changed. He does have cellmates, so there is a bit of human interaction, and that has meant a lot for his psychological health.
Only once in 560 days has Veena heard his voice. It was in March, or as the family counts time, day 460. It was a long, fought-for gesture because Michael Kovrig's father was ill. There'd been no consular visits for months because of the pandemic. Imagine having to explain that to someone in jail. So let's talk about that phone call. So once in 560 days, you've heard his voice.
Yes, it was the first time we heard his voice.
So what happened? How did that unfold?
We were sort of working on it and petitioning for it for many months, and then all of a sudden, sort of 48 hours before it happened, okay, it's going to happen. And 20 minutes beforehand, I got a call on my cell phone saying they will patch Michael through in a few minutes, and that's exactly what happened. It was meant to be a 15-minute phone call, and it was with Michael's father, his sister, and myself. It ended up being 16 minutes and 47 seconds. To be honest, it was probably the most sort of meaningful and impactful 16 minutes and 42 seconds of my life, because we got so much in. Like, Michael was incredible. He had no idea the call was happening, but the minute he heard my voice, he said, well, his question was, V, is that you? Veena, is that you? And I said, yes, and I'm here with your father and your sister. And he just, like, in a second realized what was happening and started to speak, and immediately, talked about how we're doing and how much he loves us and misses us and that he's okay, and was very worried about his dad, and I'm so grateful that that call took place.
When we come back,
help me feel less isolated. Let me share the love I have for you, and we'll get through this together. Love, Michael.
Letters from Michael Kovrig were a lifeline to his family, but those letters have stopped coming. Canadian Michael Kovrig's family may have only heard his voice once in 560 days of detention in a Chinese prison, but they do have a sense of how he's managing thanks to letters. Initially 1 a month, but even those have stopped now. The last letter received was in March. For Veena, Najibullah, they are treasures. No doubt they're poetry. Are you okay to read some of his letters?
Yes, sure. So this one actually was early. This was in July, right after his solitary ended. And he says, if there's one faint silver lining to this hell, It's this: trauma carved caverns of psychological pain through my mind. As I strive to heal and recover, I find myself filling those gulfs with a love for you and for life that is vast, deep, and more profound and comforting than what I've ever experienced before. So as I sit here, tinnitus ringing in the silence, as I walk in circles, pollution clogging my nose, come sit with me and walk with me in spirit. Help me feel less isolated. Let me share the love I have for you, and we'll get through this together. Love, Michael.
There's more than heartache here. There's determination to get both men out. And part of Vina's work has been to lobby wherever she can and learn everything she can about the detention of Meng Wanzhou and Canada's options. So Vina, I know you've been following the case of Meng Wanzhou very carefully, including going to the court.
Yes,
and nobody
I was
knew
in
who you were.
Vancouver.
You
Yes.
wandered right past all those cameras. Nobody knew who you were.
That's right.
What is the relationship between her right now and them?
As long as that situation is continuing in Vancouver, it is very difficult to imagine a way to secure Michael's freedom, to secure both our Michael and Michael Spauer's freedom.
Last night, China said that Canada is playing, the role of accomplice to the United States. When you hear that, what do you think?
I mean, that has been the Chinese position since day one. They have made it very clear that they view the arrest of Meng Wanzhou as a political act orchestrated by the United States, and that Canada went along with that. The language sort of varies between us being accomplices versus us being sort of just naive, but the theme has been consistent. She's taken for political reasons, she needs to be released, and Canada is paying the price for that decision.
So we know that Donald Trump said that he would bring up the matter, the case of the detention of the Canadians at every opportunity with China, but he signed multiple agreements with China since then. So do you have any sense from the White House of what they've actually been doing?
There's definitely been support in words from the United States. I don't know to what extent in private conversations or negotiations there has been any discussion of this matter. What I do know is that it's day 560, and our Michael and Michael Spauer are still in jail. They are continuing to suffer and pay the price for something that they had nothing to do with. They are pawns in this bigger geopolitical game, and it's time for us to take action. Words are no longer enough.
What do you want the Chinese authorities to hear from you?
You are holding an innocent man. Michael has done nothing to endanger China or Chinese people. Michael has devoted his professional career to building peace in the world, to building bridges between China and the rest of the world, to understanding China. He has great respect for the language and for the culture and for the people. Detaining an innocent man and inflicting so much suffering on him and his family does not in any way serve the interests of China. In fact, it does the opposite. It sends a chilling effect to all those people who are interested in building bridges with China, to all the people that are interested in a world that is more peaceful and just. This is unfair, this is unnecessary, and a great nation does not need to engage in hostage diplomacy or use people as pawns to prosecute its foreign policy. That is unnecessary, and I hope they will release him.
So there is still much more to say, particularly about Canada's next moves. We will dive into that tomorrow on The National. Michael Kovrig's father and sister, on that moment they heard his voice.
To be reassured by him that he was okay really helped a lot.
Kovrig's family refused to believe that's the last they'll hear from him. And rather than wait anymore, they have been studying options. We'll have a closer look at the legal opinion that says there is something Canada can do to free Michael Kovrig and Michael Spauer if Canada really wants to. Release Meng Wanzhou.
According to the law, according to the Extradition Act, according to legal opinions offered by very bright legal experts, we can. So let's have the conversation of whether we should.
Canada's Choice, tomorrow on The National.
And next on The National, a show of solidarity after an act of hate.
The entire garage area has rallied around Bubba Wallace and the number 43 today.
Bubba Wallace helped convince NASCAR to drop the Confederate flag. Now the FBI is investigating after a noose was left in his garage. That and the outpouring of support. Next. A public viewing for Rayshard Brooks was held today at a historic church in Atlanta. Brooks was fatally shot by police in a Wendy's parking lot 10 days ago. The former officer involved has been charged with murder. Today's memorial was held at the same church where Martin Luther King Jr. preached. There will be a private funeral tomorrow. Now, events off the track have dominated NASCAR coverage this weekend. First, the banning of Confederate flags, a common sight among some fans. Now, a federal investigation into a racist attack targeting the circuit's only full-time black driver. But as Cameron McIntosh shows us, today's race showed a moment of unity for a sport confronting its past.
This was just recently painted in the tri-oval grass.
Strong words, followed up by a show of solidarity.
All of NASCAR's drivers have rallied around Bubba Wallace.
At the Geico 500 in Talladega, 40 NASCAR crews, including legendary racer Richard Petty, pushing Bubba Wallace to the start line. The apparent target of a racist attack after a noose was found hanging in his garage, an act now under investigation by the FBI.
Get yourself a deep breath, get your mind right. Let's go shut these haters up.
NASCAR's only black driver, Wallace has been vocal in pushing for inclusiveness. 2 weeks ago, branding his car with a Black Lives Matter logo. He persuaded NASCAR to ban the Confederate flag at all of its events.
Walking into an event and feeling uncomfortable, that's it. If you felt uncomfortable, you would want change. And so I'm speaking up for the people that show up to the racetrack and feel that type of way.
They want to demolish our heritage.
The same weekend, President Trump bemoaned cancel culture and the, quote, radical left. Many showed up outside the race with Confederate flags. One even pulled behind a plane. But it's that noose that really has the sport rattled. Only NASCAR staff were supposed to have access to the area near Wallace's car.
I was absolutely disgusted and sickened.
Winnipeg's Amber Balkan is a fellow NASCAR driver. Her fiancé, CFLer Jordan Reeves, says he has felt racism at NASCAR events.
We just took a big step forward and we just got pushed back 10 steps. So I'm really hoping we find out who did this.
I think the rest of us just need to come together and not let them be louder.
NASCAR vows to ban whoever is responsible. Looking like he could win with 6 laps to go, Wallace came in 14th and declared a moral victory.
The sport is changing. The deal that happened yesterday, sorry I'm not wearing my mask, but I wanted to show whoever it was that you're not going to take away my smile. And I'm going to keep on going. Thank you.
This race destined to be remembered for what happened off the track. Cameron McIntosh, CBC News, Winnipeg.
Coming up on The National, a music teacher who went the extra mile and found a chorus of support.
I thought, okay, I'll DM the Arkells Instagram anyways and just let them know what I had done.
How a big-name band turned everyday music lessons into memories they'll have for a lifetime in our moment. But first. All right, so this is a concert about as strange as our times. The audience, 2,300 plants, all sitting nicely in their seats today in this Barcelona Opera House. This is a celebration of Spain's 3-month-long lockdown ending and a nod to the experience of the artist behind it, who said he was inspired by nature while in isolation. The concert was also live streamed. Those plants will be gifted to healthcare workers.
I'm Josh Block. Tomorrow on CBC's daily news podcast, Front Burner, a third Mexican worker has died from COVID-19 on a Canadian farm. 2 people who staff a hotline for migrant farm workers give us an inside look at this crisis as it unfolded. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Here are some other stories we are following tonight on The National. Temperatures in the Arctic Circle hit a record high this weekend, 38 degrees Celsius, if you can believe that, in a small Siberian town where the average high is 20 degrees in June. A persistent heat wave is fueling severe forest fires in the region. And Saudi Arabia is limiting this year's pilgrimage to Mecca because of the pandemic. The Hajj, which will take place next month, traditionally draws more than 2 million Muslims from around the world. But this year, only a limited number of Saudi citizens and residents will be allowed to take part, following physical distancing measures.
Here in Canada, the pandemic has bred another kind of virus, hate, especially against Chinese Canadians. The evidence in a survey released today. Greg Rasmussen has the findings.
For those devoted to fighting racism, it's a devastating setback.
Very disturbing, very concerning, and as Canadians, this should not be happening in our community. This is absolutely despicable.
The poll adds to a growing body of evidence, documenting what many Chinese Canadians have been experiencing in recent months. 50% report being called names or insulted as a direct result of COVID-19. 30% say they've seen racist graffiti or messages on social media.
My son was attending school, and a kid in his class had told him that he had the coronavirus because he was Chinese. And it was very shocking to have to have that conversation with a young child.
Jamie Liu grew more worried after hearing the U.S. president once again blame China for the devastating coronavirus.
That name gets further and further away from China as opposed to calling it the Chinese virus. I can name Kung Flu.
Doesn't give me a lot of hope that we can move past this kind of rhetoric and this misinformation and this complete racist behavior.
The poll's authors say even those who have been here for generations feel alienated and bullied.
Indeed, only 13% report that they feel like the rest of the country sees them as fully Canadian all the time.
Those caught up in this battle say it's not simple or quick to undo the damage.
Racism is not being born. We don't born with racism, but racism is a learned behavior and it can be unlearned.
This study, stark evidence of just how much more work needs to be done. Greg Rasmussen, CBC News, Richmond, BC.
When we come back, a musical moment to remember for some Ontario students.
Some of them were saying they hadn't felt that good in months.
How a music teacher's appeal brought her pupils a boost from some Canadian celebrities. Next.
Julia Jung is a Toronto music teacher. She's wanting her students to learn as much as possible during the pandemic. She even delivered instruments to their homes, consistently going this extra mile. And people took notice. The Canadian band Arkells learned about Jung's efforts, and they decided to give back in a big way. That is our moment.
I'm a high school music teacher, and I'm a huge fan of the Arkells. And Max Kerman has been leading these Flatten the Curve music classes through Instagram Live. I chose to take their new single, so Years in the Making, and I wanted to arrange it for a high school concert band. So I ended up reaching out to the Arkells, and Max Kerman actually DM'd me back and said, "This is amazing." And so Max had me come on, and I was fangirling.
You're a music teacher. I'm a bit of a music teacher. We want to introduce you to one of my students from FDC. Julia, this is our friend, Coach Nick Nurse.
So we brought in Nick Nurse, and I was like, "Oh my goodness!" And he's like, "Hi, Julia."
We're gonna get you some new instruments to the $5,000.
Oh my gosh! I was just so blown away. Every one of my kids afterwards was just losing their mind, talking about how amazing this was and how amazing he is, and how they were just so thrilled. And some of them were saying they hadn't felt that good in months.
Okay, so Julia is a huge Raptors fan, yay Nick Nurse, a huge Arkells fan, yay Max. We are all now Julia fans. She said maybe she'd get, an Arkells t-shirt, but That $25,000 for the instruments and an Arkells t-shirt, that's a pretty good day.
That's the best part. Yeah, she still gets the T-shirt, and you know, I'm sure the $25,000 feels good. But I bet, I mean, nothing beats that feeling of being noticed, right? Of being appreciated. And indeed, she says this by far is a career highlight for her. So good for her and all of her students. That's the National for this Monday, June 22nd. Have a good night.